Beloit, Wisconsin, a factory floor that has run, in some form, since before the First World War. A technician leans over a lathe, shaping a steel cylinder liner the size of a fire hydrant. Sparks arc off the metal in short rhythmic bursts. On the wall behind him hangs a blueprint dated 1937, faded, yellowed, but still the reference document for the part in his hands. He is not building a museum piece. He is building a diesel engine for a United States Navy submarine that has not been launched yet. The design is called Opposed-Piston, two pistons per cylinder firing toward each other. No cylinder head at all. It sounds like something that should have died with the age of steam. Instead, it is one of the last pieces of heavy American industrial machinery, still manufactured almost exactly the way it was 90 years ago, and the Navy has no other supplier for it. Most Americans have never heard the name on the building outside. Fewer still know it once belonged to a company that made grain scales and farm equipment before it ever touched a diesel engine. But the real story of Fairbanks-Morse is not just about an engine that outlasted its era. It is the story of a company that survived 4 owners, 3 names, and 2 near extinctions, by staying quietly, stubbornly unglamorous, while everyone flasher around it collapsed. Every week on this channel, we dig into the machines and the names that once defined American industrial power. The engines, the shipyards, the factories that built an empire, and then watch the market move on without them. Some of these companies vanished completely. Others got swallowed, renamed, sold off in pieces. And a rare few are still standing working right now, under a name most people have never heard. This is one of those stories. If that sounds like your kind of history, consider subscribing. We post a new one every week. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place. St. Johnsbury, Vermont, in 1823. A blacksmith and inventor named Thaddeus Fairbanks leased a small ironworks from a cousin and started making 2 things: cast iron plows and heating stoves. Nothing about it suggested a company that would one day build the engines running America's nuclear submarines. Vermont in the 1820s was farm country, and the Fairbanks was solving a farmer's problem. Better tools for breaking hard New England soil, better stoves for surviving the winter that came with it. The unmet need that actually built the companies came a few years later, and it had nothing to do with engines at all. In 1829, Fairbanks tried his hand at a hemp processing business and failed, but the machinery he built to weigh raw hemp led him somewhere unexpected, toward a better scale. Existing platform scales of the era were clumsy, inaccurate, and expensive to maintain. Fairbanks patented a new design in 1832 that solved all 3 problems at once. And it worked so well that farmers, grain merchants, and railroads across the country started buying it. Within a generation, with his brother Erastus running the business side, the Fairbanks scale wasn't just popular in the United States. It was shipping to Europe, South America, and Imperial China, and it had won more than 60 medals in international competition. For most of the 19th century, before the name Ford meant anything, the name Fairbanks was the most recognized American manufacturer in the world. That's the part of the story most people who know Fairbanks-Morse at all already know. What they usually miss is how the company got to Wisconsin and to diesel engines, almost by accident. The connective piece was a man named Charles Hosmer Morse, a Fairbanks employee who moved to Chicago in the 1860s to run sales. When the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 leveled the city, Morse reopened the company's fire-damaged office under a new name, Fairbanks, Morse & Company. From that Chicago base, Morse spent the next 2 decades doing something the original Vermont Iron Works never had to do, acquiring other companies to fill out the product line. In 1880, that meant absorbing a small operation up in Beloit, Wisconsin, called the Eclipse Windmill Company, founded by a former missionary named Leonard Wheeler, who had designed a windmill durable enough to survive the open prairie. By the early 1890s, Fairbanks-Morse & Company had folded in a steam engine maker as well, and Beloit, not Vermont, not Chicago, became the manufacturing heart of the business. None of this history involved diesel engines yet, and that's the point worth sitting with for a moment. a company that started as a scale maker and a windmill maker, had no obvious business becoming the most trusted name in American submarine propulsion. But industrial companies of that era didn't specialize the way modern corporations do. If you could cast iron, machine precision parts, and manufacture at scale, you could pivot into almost anything the market demanded next. And in the years leading up to the Second World War, the United States Navy was about to demand something very specific, and very badly. By the early 1930s, the Navy had staked its future submarine fleet on a new diesel engine design from a company called Hooven, Owens, Rentschler. It was ambitious, lightweight, and mechanically elegant on paper. In practice, it was a catastrophe, cracking crankshafts, failing bearings, and engines that left submarines stranded or limping home on one working propulsion unit while a war was beginning in the Pacific. The Navy needed a replacement, and it needed one that worked, not one that impressed anyone with technical sophistication. Fairbanks-Morse and Company had spent since 1932 quietly building diesel engines in Beloit using a design philosophy that was almost the opposite of HOR's, a design so mechanically simple and so tolerant of shipboard abuse that nobody thought to call it exciting. That unglamorous engine was about to become the reason American submarines survived the war at all. To understand why Fairbanks-Morse succeeded where the Navy's showcase engine failed, you first have to understand the problem every submarine diesel of the 1930s was trying to solve. A submarine engine has to do something almost contradictory. It needs enormous power packed into the smallest possible space, because every cubic foot inside a submarine's pressure hull is fighting for room against batteries, torpedoes, and the crew. It needs to survive constant vibration, saltwater corrosion, and the kind of abuse that a stationary factory engine never faces. And it needs to be, above all, reliable, because an engine failure at sea in a submarine isn't an inconvenience. It can be a death sentence. Most diesel engines of that era used a conventional design. One piston per cylinder, moving up and down inside a chamber sealed at the top by a cylinder head. A heavy metal cap bolted over the combustion space. The cylinder head is where a lot of engines fail. It has to withstand extreme heat and pressure while sealing tightly enough to keep combustion gases from leaking. And on a submarine, a failed head gasket or a cracked head can take an engine out of service in the middle of a war patrol. In the early 1930s, Fairbanks-Morse took a different approach. The company licensed a design from a German engineering firm, Junkers, for what's called an opposed-piston engine. An opposed-piston engine is a design where two pistons sit inside a single cylinder and move toward each other, meeting almost in the middle, where combustion happens between them. There is no cylinder head at all, because there's no need for one. Each piston does the job that a head and a piston would normally split between them, which means fewer parts, fewer seals to fail, and a design that's mechanically simpler, even though it looks stranger on paper. Fairbanks-Morse called its first version of this engine the Model 38. In its early configuration, 8 cylinders, an 8-inch bore, and 2 10-inch piston strokes per cylinder, the engine displaced just over 8,000 cubic inches and produced about 1,200 horsepower at 720 RPM. In December 1930, the Navy placed its first real order, 8 of these engines, split between 2 new Porpoise-class submarines, USS Plunger and USS Pollock. It was a modest bet, not the centerpiece of the submarine fleet, just one option among several the Navy was testing. It did not go perfectly. The early 38A8 engines ran into their own set of problems in service, and Fairbanks-Morse went back to the drawing board rather than defend a flawed design. That decision, the willingness to redesign rather than double down, turned out to matter enormously. Engineers reworked the cylinder geometry, the port layout, and the cooling arrangement, and by 1937 and 1938 the company had a new version ready, the Model 38D818. That engine would go on to power more American submarines through World War II than almost any other single piece of hardware in the fleet, and it would do it while the Navy's other major submarine engine program, the one built by Hooven, Owens, Rentschler, was falling apart in front of the entire fleet. The numbers on the 38D-818 tell you exactly why it earned the Navy's trust. The bore grew slightly to 8 1/8 inches, which is where the engine's name comes from, with a 10-inch stroke on each of the two opposing pistons, and a cylinder standing 38 inches tall. Depending on configuration, a submarine's engine room might carry 3 or 4 of these units, each producing well over 1,000 horsepower, working together to charge batteries and drive the boat on the surface. For contrast, the Navy's other reliable wartime option came from General Motors, the Winton, later Cleveland Diesel, engines used aboard many Gato and Balao-class submarines. GM's design was a conventional 4-stroke engine, heavier for its output, but backed by the industrial muscle and mass production discipline of the largest manufacturer in the country. Where GM competed on production scale and corporate resources, Fairbanks-Morse competed on something narrower and, in wartime, more valuable. An engine that came apart into fewer things that could go wrong. And then there was the engine Fairbanks-Morse was actually replacing. The Hooven-Owens-Rentschler design that the Navy had bet on before the war was, on paper, the more sophisticated machine. Lighter, more powerful for its size, engineered by a team confident they were building the future of submarine propulsion. In practice, it cracked crankshafts, failed bearings, and left boats stranded far from home with a war underway in the Pacific. Fairbanks-Morse never tried to out-engineer war. It built something plainer, heavier, and far more forgiving of the abuse a wartime submarine crew would inevitably put it through. The first real proof came fast. As HOR-powered submarines began limping back to port with engine casualties in 1942 and 1940, the Navy started re-engining boats with Fairbanks-Morse and GM diesels instead. And new construction shifted decisively toward the two proven designs. Submarines running Fairbanks-Morse power plants went on to complete war patrols across the Pacific with a level of mechanical reliability the HOR boats had never come close to matching. Some of those same submarines and some of those same engines still exist today as museum ships, their 38D-818s intact inside preserved hulls, like USS Pomponito and USS Torsk. It wasn't the flashiest engine the Navy had access to during the war. It was, by a wide margin, the one that worked. By 1938, the 38D-818 was no longer an experiment. It was the standard. The Navy's submarine construction program was about to expand faster than at any point in American history, and the Fairbanks-Morse expanded with it. Through the war years, the company's Opposed-Piston engines went into Gato-class submarines, starting in 1941, and then into the improved Balao-class boats that followed from 1942 onward. Dozens of hulls, each one carrying multiple 38D-818 units in its engine rooms, working alongside the competing GM Winton and Cleveland diesel engines that powered the rest of the fleet. The Navy never fully standardized on one manufacturer. It kept both suppliers running in parallel, which meant Fairbanks-Morse was competing every single day, boat by boat, contract by contract, against a company with vastly more manufacturing capacity behind it. That competition shaped how each company grew. General Motors could lean on its automotive-scale production lines and its existing dealer and service network to churn out Winton and Cleveland diesel engines faster than almost anyone. Fairbanks-Morse, still a comparatively modest industrial manufacturer out of Beloit, couldn't win a pure numbers game. So it didn't try to. It built a reputation instead. Engine rooms that ran without drama, submarines that came back from patrol with their diesels intact. The Navy's own wartime reliability reports increasingly reflected that difference. And by the middle of the war, requests for Fairbanks-Morse power plants were coming in not just for new construction but as replacements for the failed HOR engines, still limping through the fleet. The engine's reach extended past submarines almost immediately. The same 38 series diesels went into the Wind-class icebreakers built for Arctic and Antarctic operations, where an engine that could run for months without a major failure wasn't a luxury. It was the only thing standing between the crew and being stranded in ice. They powered Edsall-class destroyer escorts, smaller surface combatants built in enormous numbers to hunt German U-boats in the Atlantic. Each new application meant a new set of engineers at a new shipyard learning to maintain the same opposed piston architecture which, quietly, without anyone announcing it, was becoming one of the most widely trusted diesel platforms in the entire U.S. military. Then the war ended, and Fairbanks-Morse did something that companies riding a single wartime success often fail to do. It didn't wait for the next war. In December 1945, barely months after VJ Day, the company rolled out its first commercial diesel-electric railroad locomotive, the Erie-built. So named because General Electric assembled the car body at its Erie, Pennsylvania plant while Fairbanks-Morse supplied the prime mover, a 10-cylinder version of the same 38D818 engine that had just spent 4 years keeping American submarines alive in the Pacific. The Erie-built was Fairbanks-Morse's opening bid in a locomotive market dominated by two giants, Electromotive's E&F units and Alco's competing PA line. And the company's pitch was almost embarrassingly simple. Take the submarine engine that had just proven itself in the most demanding environment imaginable, put it on rails instead of in a hull, and sell reliability as the whole argument. Between December 1945 and early 1949, Fairbanks-Morse sold 111 Erie-built units to 7 American railroads: the Santa Fe, the Chicago and Northwestern, the Kansas City Southern, the Milwaukee Road, the New York Central, the Pennsylvania Railroad, and Union Pacific. Union Pacific's president wrote to his own board that the company had been slow to embrace diesel power and was now committing to it. A small human moment of an old railroad executive admitting the steam era was over. From there, the model line grew the way any successful platform grows, variation on a proven core. The H-1044 switcher arrived in 1944 and stayed in production through 1950, with 195 units built. The H-1544 and H-2044 followed in 1947, giving railroads a mid-sized road switcher option. By 1950, Fairbanks-Morse had formalized its full locomotive catalog into what it called the Consolidated Line, the C-liners, offered in 1,600, 2,000, and 2,400 horsepower configurations, all built around the same opposed-piston engine family. The New York Central alone bought 33 C-liners, and across its full relationship with the company, purchased over 100 Fairbanks-Morse locomotives by the early 1950s. Behind every one of those sales was a layer of human expertise that didn't show up in a spec sheet. Railroads accustomed to steam locomotives had no in-house experience with opposed-piston diesel maintenance, and Fairbanks-Morse had to send its own field service engineers out from Beloit to train roundhouse mechanics who had spent their careers around boilers and driving rods, not crankshafts and scavenging ports. It was slow, patient, unglamorous work, teaching a Milwaukee road machinist how to time an engine with 2 crankshafts instead of 1. And it built exactly the kind of loyalty that kept railroads coming back for their next locomotive order. By the early 1950s, the picture was clear. Fairbanks-Morse engines were running American submarines, icebreakers, destroyer escorts, and now locomotives on 7 major railroads. A company that had entered the diesel business less than 20 years earlier, building an engine nobody else wanted to attempt, had become an infrastructure. Quiet, dependable, and everywhere, without ever becoming a household name. By the height of the war, Fairbanks-Morse wasn't just building engines. It was building the people who kept them running, and that infrastructure would end up outlasting the war itself. The Navy couldn't simply hand a submarine crew a new engine and expect them to master it. Opposed-piston diesels ran on principles no sailor trained on conventional engines had ever encountered. 2 crankshafts instead of 1. No cylinder head to inspect. A scavenging system with dozens of ports instead of a handful of valves. So Fairbanks-Morse turned part of its Beloit operation into something close to a technical school, training hundreds of Navy enginemen directly on the same production floor, where their engines were being built, before those sailors ever set foot on a submarine. It was an unusual arrangement for the era, a private manufacturer effectively running military technical education out of its own factory. But it meant that every boat leaving with a Fairbanks-Morse power plant also carried a crew that actually understood what was inside the engine room. The production floor itself became one of the defining images of the American home front. With so many men at war, the Beloit plant filled its assembly lines with women. machinists, welders, engine assemblers, running a wartime pace that at its peak turned out a finished submarine or surface ship engine roughly once every single day. It's worth sitting with that rhythm for a second. Somewhere in Wisconsin, 7 days a week, month after month, a fully assembled 38D-818 rolled off the line and headed toward a shipyard, while the war in the Pacific hung partly on whether that pace could hold. It did. That daily ritual, the whistle at shift change, the line of finished engine blocks queued for shipment, women in coveralls signing off inspection cards on machinery that would soon be running inside a war zone thousands of miles away, became for a few years as routine and as consequential as anything happening on the front lines. The numbers, once the war ended, told the story in plain terms. Fairbanks-Morse had manufactured nearly 1,200 diesel engines for Navy submarines and surface ships during World War II, a figure that placed the company's Beloit plant among the most important single sources of naval propulsion power in the entire American war effort, despite the company being a fraction of the size of its chief rival, General Motors. And unlike a wartime contractor that quietly winds down once the shooting stops, Fairbanks-Morse kept climbing. The locomotive line, Erie Builts, then H-series switchers, then the consolidated Sealiners, carried the company's Opposed-Piston reputation onto 7 major American railroads through the late 1940s and into the 1950s. Marine engines kept going into Coast Guard cutters and commercial vessels. Stationary versions powered pump houses and generating stations. By the late 1950s, the company's flagship locomotive product, a 2,400 horsepower unit known as the Trainmaster, represented what insiders at the time considered the absolute high point of the business, the widest, most confident expression yet of what the Opposed-Piston platform could do. Built by a company that had gone, in barely 2 decades, from a scale and windmill manufacturer to one of the most trusted names in American heavy propulsion, nobody standing on the Beloit factory floor in the late 1950s was thinking about collapse. The engine that had saved the submarine fleet was now hauling passenger trains across 3 time zones, powering icebreakers through Arctic ice, and running river pump stations capable of moving 1 million gallons of water a minute. Fairbanks-Morse had become something bigger than a product line. It had become an infrastructure, quietly embedded in American rail, sea, and industrial power, exactly the kind of position that feels, from the inside, completely unshakable. That feeling was about to be tested, but finding the top of the market is dangerous, because that is exactly where the rules begin to change. The first crack didn't come from a competitor's engineering breakthrough. It came from geography. Out on the high desert lines of the American West, in the heat and thin air where Fairbanks-Morse locomotives were now hauling freight for railroads like Union Pacific, the same opposed-piston design that had proven itself bulletproof inside a submarine's engine room, surrounded by cool sea-level ocean air, started running hot. The scavenging system that worked flawlessly at sea struggled at altitude. Maintenance costs crept up. Reliability, the one trait the entire Fairbanks-Morse reputation had been built on, began to look less certain outside the environment the engine was originally designed for. At the same moment, a much larger force was gathering, one that had nothing to do with engineering at all. Across American industry in the 1950s, a new kind of company was emerging, the conglomerate, built not by making things but by buying companies that made things, bundling them into diversified portfolios, and running them for return on capital rather than product loyalty. Independent industrial manufacturers with strong brand names and steady cash flow, exactly the profile Fairbanks-Morse now fit, were becoming attractive targets for exactly that kind of buyer. Neither pressure was fatal on its own. A design flaw in one product line doesn't sink a company with a diversified portfolio of submarines, marine engines, pumps, and industrial equipment behind it. And being an attractive acquisition target isn't a crisis. It can just as easily be an opportunity. But both pressures were now converging on the same company at the same time. Just as the post-war economy was shifting under everyone's feet, Fairbanks-Morse was about to find out what happens to a company built on quiet reliability when the outside world stops rewarding quiet reliability and starts rewarding something else entirely. The trap that caught Fairbanks-Morse wasn't a technology failure. It was Texas itself, a company that manufactures dependable engines for the Navy, sells locomotives to 7 major railroads, and generates steady cash flow year after year. Isn't just a good business, it's an attractive one. And in the conglomerate era of the 1950s, attractive meant target. Diversified holding companies were racing to acquire exactly this kind of firm. Established brand, loyal customers, predictable earnings, and a name that had meant quality for over a century. Fairbanks-Morse checked every box. The same qualities that had made the company indispensable to the Navy now made it indispensable to a very different kind of buyer, one interested less in opposed-piston engineering and more in balance sheets. In 1958, that buyer arrived. Penn Texas Corporation, an aggressive young conglomerate that had already been assembling a portfolio of industrial manufacturers, merged with Fairbanks-Morse to form a new combined entity, the Fairbanks-Whitney Corporation. On paper, it looked like exactly the kind of deal that made sense in that decade. A proven manufacturer joining a larger, better capitalized parent that could fund expansion and smooth out the ups and downs of any single business cycle. In practice, the merger loaded Fairbanks-Morse's steady, century-old business with debt it hadn't carried before. Penn Texas had financed its stock purchases for the acquisition with borrowed money, on the order of $9.5 million just for the key holdings, and that debt now sat on top of an operating company that had built its reputation on patient, unhurried engineering, not on servicing a leveraged balance sheet. It wasn't mismanagement exactly. It was the ordinary mechanics of the conglomerate model. Use a stable subsidiary's cash flow to service acquisition debt and fund the parent's other ambitions. Reasonable on a spreadsheet. Difficult on a factory floor that now had less room to reinvest in itself. The debt burden alone might have been survivable. What made the early 1960s genuinely dangerous was that it landed at almost exactly the moment the locomotive business, Fairbanks-Morse's proudest post-war expansion, started coming apart. The altitude and heat problems that had first surfaced out west never fully went away. Opposed-piston engines that ran flawlessly at sea level, cooled by ocean air, kept underperforming in the high desert and struggling with maintenance demands that ate into the very reliability advantage the brand had spent 2 decades building. Railroads that had once trusted Fairbanks-Morse locomotives over Alcos and electromotives began quietly shifting new orders elsewhere. By 1963, the company made the decision to exit the locomotive market entirely, walking away from a business line that, less than 15 years earlier, had been sold as the natural next chapter after the submarine engine's wartime triumph. Layered on top of a debt-heavy parent company and a shrinking product line, the numbers turned genuinely bad. By 1962, the combined Fairbanks-Whitney operation was running an annual deficit of roughly $3.5 million. A company built for a century on dependable profitability now bleeding money under conglomerate ownership. None of these were the decisions of careless executives. Diversifying into locomotives had been a rational bet on an adjacent market the company's engineering genuinely suited. Merging with a larger parent had been a rational response to an acquisition environment where independent industrials were increasingly vulnerable. Even carrying acquisition debt had been standard conglomerate practice, not recklessness, but rational decisions, made one at a time, had stacked into a company that no longer resembled the confident, expanding manufacturer of the late 1950s. In 1964, the parent company reorganized under yet another new name, Colt Industries, borrowing its identity from the firearms maker that had become the conglomerate's most recognizable asset, Fairbanks-Morse. The company that had once saved the American submarine fleet was now a division inside a company named after someone else's product. The engine still ran. The company kept changing hands. In 1966, new management arrived inside Colt Industries with a clear mandate. Stop chasing every market the old Fairbanks-Morse name could plausibly enter, and refocus on what the division actually did well: pumps and heavy diesel engines, the two businesses that had never stopped being profitable, even while locomotives and other side ventures faltered. It worked, in the narrow sense that mattered. The submarine engine business stabilized. In 1975, the company invested in a modern manufacturing facility to replace aging wartime-era infrastructure, a signal that Colt Industries, whatever else was happening at the corporate level, still saw value in keeping Beloit's engine line current. But stabilization inside a conglomerate rarely means permanence. It means the division becomes a piece, sometimes a valued piece, sometimes a piece to be traded. In 1988, Colt Industries began cutting the old Fairbanks-Morse portfolio apart. The pump division was sold off to private investors, becoming its own independent company, Fairbanks-Morse Pump. The original scale business, the very product that had built the company in 1832, was sold off the same year and became Fairbanks Scales, an independent entity with no ownership connection to the engine works in Beloit. The company that Thaddeus Fairbanks had built and Charles Morse had expanded was no longer one company at all. It was three separate businesses, scattered across three separate owners, sharing nothing but a name and 165 years of shared history. Then, in 1990, Colt Industries sold off the business it had originally been named after. The firearms division, Colt's manufacturing company, was sold to outside investors, and the parent company renamed itself once more, Coltech Industries. The submarine engine works in Beloit. The division that had never stopped quietly building 38D818 engines through every single one of these transactions was now three ownership changes and three corporate names removed from the company that had first put its diesel engines into a Porpoise-class submarine back in 1930. Coltech didn't last as an independent conglomerate either. It became a subsidiary of a larger industrial holding company, and in 2002, that relationship reorganized once more. Fairbanks-Morse's engine business emerged as part of Enpro Industries, a newly formed publicly traded company built around exactly the kind of steady, unglamorous industrial manufacturing that had defined Fairbanks-Morse since the 1930s. Under Enpro, the Beloit plant settled into something close to stability for the better part of 2 decades, one division among several, reliably profitable, rarely making headlines, still the sole supplier of large-bore diesel engines to the United States Navy submarine fleet the entire time. Then came the date that mattered, January 21, 2020. Enpro Industries sold the Fairbanks-Morse engine business to Arcline Investment Management, a private equity firm. The new owner made a decision no previous parent company had ever made in the better part of a century. It stopped treating the Beloit Engine Works as one industrial division among many and renamed it entirely around its core identity. Fairbanks-Morse Defense, a company built to serve one customer above all others, with total focus, the United States Navy. 4 owners, 3 corporate reorganizations, 2 divisions sold off and severed from the original name entirely. A locomotive business built, celebrated, and abandoned within 20 years. Through all of it, Penn, Texas, Fairbanks Whitney, Colt Industries, Coltech, Enpro, Arcline. The workers on the Beloit factory floor kept doing the same fundamental job. They kept machining cylinder liners for an engine block whose core geometry had barely changed since 1938. Logos changed. Letterhead changed. Paychecks kept coming from a different building in a different state every decade or two. The plant never closed. The line never stopped. That is the part of this story that doesn't look like every other industrial decline in this series. There was no bankruptcy filing here, no shuttered factory, no auctioned-off machinery. Fairbanks-Morse didn't collapse. It just kept getting sold, again and again and again, to whoever understood this time what it was actually worth. Today, the company that started as a Vermont scale maker in 1823 exists in 3 separate pieces, scattered across 3 separate owners, sharing nothing but a name and a shared ancestry that most of their customers have never heard of. Fairbanks Scales still makes industrial scales in Kansas City, Missouri. Fairbanks-Nijus makes pumps under Pentair's ownership. And in Beloit, Wisconsin, on the same property the company has occupied since the 1890s, Fairbanks-Morse Defense builds diesel engines for the United States Navy. That third piece is the one that matters to this story, and it is not a museum. It is an active, growing defense contractor. Owned by Arcline Investment Management since January 2020, Fairbanks-Morse Defense today produces power and propulsion equipment that, by the company's own account, is running on more than 80% of U.S. Navy surface ships equipped with medium-speed diesel engines. In 2023, the Navy named FMD the sole source for engineering and technical support of the main propulsion diesel engines aboard its Freedom-class littoral combat ships, a 5-year contract that put the company's technicians directly back into the business their predecessors had started during the World War II, training Navy sailors to maintain Fairbanks-Morse machinery. In January 2025, FMD's Hunt valve operation was awarded $96 million in purchase orders to supply critical valves for the Navy's next generation of submarines, 5 Columbia-class boats and 12 Virginia-class boats currently under construction. The lead Columbia-class submarine, USS District of Columbia, is scheduled for delivery in October 2028 and expected to enter service in 2031 at 580 feet, the largest submarine the U.S. Navy has ever built. As a key defender of our nation's freedom of the seas, the Navy's silent service relies on top performance. FMD's CEO, George Whittier, said when the valve contract was announced, "It's a modern executive's language, but the sentiment would have made perfect sense to a Fairbanks-Morse engineer in 1943. The company's entire reason for existing, then and now, has never been to dazzle anyone. It has been to make sure the Navy's submarines come home. And the engine at the center of all of it, the 38D818, updated over the decades into a version called the 38 and 818, is still, in its basic architecture, the same opposed-piston design Fairbanks-Morse licensed from a German aircraft manufacturer in the early 1930s. It now runs as backup and auxiliary power aboard Los Angeles, Seawolf, and Ohio-class nuclear submarines, boats whose main propulsion comes from a nuclear reactor, but whose crews still depend, in an emergency, on a diesel engine whose fundamental design predates the nuclear submarine itself by 2 decades. Back in Beloit, the technician sets down the finished cylinder liner, checks it against the blueprint one more time, and moves on to the next one. The line doesn't stop. It never really has. See you in the next one.